The land was a testament to endurance. It stretched out under a sky so vast and empty it felt like a judgment, a raw, blue canvas against which the sins and sorrows of men were writ small. Here, in the heart of the dust and the sage, Silas lived a life carved from silence. His ranch was not a place of comfort but a fortress of solitude, its fences a line drawn not against cattle rustlers, but against the ghosts of a world he had long since abandoned. The wind was his most constant companion, a mournful voice that whispered through the canyons and across the sparse grassland, speaking a language of loneliness he understood better than any human tongue. Each sunrise was a slow bleed of color over the eastern mesas, a daily resurrection that brought no joy, only a renewed sense of the duty that bound him to this earth. He moved with the rhythm of the seasons, his hands gnarled and scarred from work that was both penance and purpose. He was a man made of the very rock and grit that surrounded him, his features weathered by sun and sorrow, his eyes holding the flat, distant look of a hawk scanning a barren horizon. He spoke so rarely that the sound of his own voice was a stranger to him, a rough, unused thing. His actions were his words, the sure, gentle way he mended a broken fence post, the quiet patience with which he tended his horses, the unwavering gaze that saw everything and revealed nothing. The world saw a recluse, a hard man on a hard piece of land. But within the silent chambers of his heart, a memory lived and breathed, a wound that had never closed, a promise that had become the central pillar of his desolate existence. It was a memory of a face, of a voice, of a light that had been extinguished, leaving him in a perpetual twilight. The land, his father had once told him, will test your heart. And Silas's heart had been tested by a fire that had burned everything away, leaving only the unyielding bedrock of a single, haunting love. He saw the disturbance first as a shimmer of heat on the distant trail, a wavering in the air that did not belong. The world here was made of straight lines and predictable movements, the slow drift of a buzzard, the scuttling of a lizard, the unyielding line of the horizon. This was different. It was a flaw in the pattern, a human shape in a landscape that had long been emptied of them. He stopped his work, his hand resting on the smooth, worn wood of an axe handle, his body utterly still. He was not a man given to curiosity, but to caution. Strangers were heralds of trouble, their presence a disruption to the fragile peace he had painstakingly built. He watched from the shade of his porch as the shape grew, stumbling, faltering, a fragile figure wrapped in the immensity of the plains. It was a woman. The realization did not soften him, it hardened his vigilance. He had seen what this land did to the unprepared, how it stripped away hope and left only sun-bleached bone. As she drew closer, details emerged from the haze. She was dressed in something foreign, a high-collared dress of grey silk, now tattered and coated in a fine layer of ochre dust. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, had come loose, framing a face of impossible delicacy, streaked with dirt and exhaustion. He remained where he was, a silent sentinel, his shadow long and sharp in the late afternoon sun. He felt no pity, only a deep, weary sense of inevitability. She collapsed not 20 yards from his homestead, a small, crumpled heap against the vastness. For a long moment, he did not move. The wind kicked up dust around her still form. Then, with a sigh that was more air than sound, he set down his axe and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the dry earth, each step a reluctant surrender to the intrusion. He knelt, his movement slow, deliberate, the way one approaches a frightened animal. He saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. When he reached out to turn her, his calloused fingers brushed against the skin of her arm, and a jolt, like a forgotten nerve coming back to life, shot through him. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep pools of exhaustion, but in them, a flicker of recognition ignited. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her lips parted, and a voice, a whisper of a voice, fragile as a dry leaf, reached him across the chasm of years. "Silas," she breathed, her name for him a ghost on the wind. "Do you remember me?" And the lone rancher froze, the world narrowing to this face from the past, the fortress of his solitude breached and shattered in a single, impossible heartbeat. Her name was Myion. The world dissolved. The scent of dust and the heat of the sun vanished, replaced by the faint aroma of laundry soap and ginger, the cool, damp air of a small shop in a burgeoning railroad town. He was a boy again, all sharp angles and scuffed knuckles, his silence not yet a shield but a simple state of being. He was the boy who did odd jobs for the gruff men who laid the iron tracks, his only inheritance a worn leather-bound journal of his father's sayings. One echoed in his memory now, a constant refrain from that time: a man's honor is the only land he truly owns. He had lived in the spaces between things, in the alley behind the general store, in the stables of the saloon, a stray dog of a boy whom no one claimed. No one except her. Myion was the daughter of the laundryman, a quiet, serious man whose hands were perpetually softened by steam and water. She was a flicker of color in a world of brown dust and grey wood, her laughter a sound like tiny, wind-blown bells. She was not supposed to speak to him. He was a drifter's son, an outcast. She was from a family that kept to itself, navigating the harsh currents of this new world with quiet dignity. But children forge their own laws. Their friendship began with a shared secret, a small, hidden spring behind the church, where wildflowers grew in defiant bursts of purple and yellow. He showed it to her, his one discovery, his one piece of beauty. She, in turn, shared her stories, tales from a land across the ocean, filled with dragons and wise emperors. He would listen, mesmerized, while she traced characters in the dirt with a stick. He did not understand the symbols, but he understood the care with which she drew them. She taught him her name, guiding his clumsy fingers to form the lines. He taught her the names of the constellations, the patterns his father had shown him, eternal and unchanging in the night sky. In that small pocket of the world, they were not a poor boy and a Chinese girl. They were simply Silas and Myion. He remembered the texture of the smooth, grey stone he'd found in the creek bed, a perfect oval. He had given it to her, a silent offering. She had kept it, he knew, slipping it into the pocket of her simple tunic, a secret weight that belonged only to them. Their shared world, fragile as a spider's web, could not remain untouched forever. Garrison arrived in town that summer. He was the son of the man who owned the bank, the freight company, and half the land the town was built on. He returned from some eastern school clad in fine wool suits that seemed to repel the dust, his smile as polished and cold as a new coin. He walked through the town as if it were a map of his future acquisitions, his gaze lingering on everything he deemed valuable. And his gaze lingered on Myion. He saw her not as Silas did, not as a person whose laughter was a rare and precious sound, but as an exotic flower he wished to pluck and place in his buttonhole. He would frequent the laundry, leaving clothes that were barely soiled, engaging her father in conversations that were layered with veiled promises and threats. The community, the very people who nodded to Silas on the street, felt the change. A quiet tension settled over the town. Men spoke in lower voices when Garrison passed, debts were called in with a newfound urgency. Garrison began to court Myion in his arrogant, possessive way, bringing her gifts she did not want, silk ribbons and lacquered boxes that seemed alien and garish in her simple life. Silas would watch from the shadows, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He saw the fear in her father's eyes and the polite, strained smile on Myion's face. One evening, by their secret spring, the weight of it all became too much. The air was thick with the coming of a storm, the sky bruised purple at the edges. "He wants my father to sign a new contract," Myion whispered, her gaze fixed on the darkening water. "He says it will bring security." Silas, who understood little of contracts but much of predators, knew what kind of security Garrison offered. It was the security of a cage. "We could go," he said, the words clumsy, torn from a place deep inside him. "West. There's land no one has claimed." It was a boy's dream, foolish and impossible. But in her eyes, he saw a flicker of the same desperate hope. She reached into her pocket and her fingers closed around the smooth, grey river stone. "Promise me, Silas," she said, her voice fierce. "Promise me you will never forget this place. That you'll never forget me." He placed his rough hand over hers. "I promise," he swore. Always it was a vow made against the coming storm, a child's oath against the power of a corrupt world, a promise that would become both his anchor and his curse. The storm broke, not in the sky, but in their lives. Garrison's patience, thin as it was, finally snapped. He did not wish to court, he wished to own. The contract he had offered Myion's father was a trap, a web of debt and obligation from which there was no escape. The townspeople watched, their faces grim, their hands tied. They were all caught in the same web, indebted to Garrison's father, their silence bought and paid for. The confrontation happened on a blistering afternoon. Garrison, flanked by 2 hired men, stood before the laundry, his charm replaced by an undisguised sneer. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, a foreclosure notice, a bill of sale, the documents that would ruin Myion's family and leave them with nothing. The terms were simple, and spoken for all to hear. The debt would be forgiven. The family would be given a new, larger shop. In exchange for Myion's hand in marriage. It was not a proposal, it was a transaction. Silas, who had been splitting wood nearby, heard the commotion. He saw the terror on Myion's face and the utter despair that broke her father's proud posture. Something inside him, a wild, protective instinct, ignited. He was 16, lean but strong from years of hard labor, and for a moment, he was not a powerless boy. He was a force of nature. He dropped the axe and walked forward, placing himself between Garrison and the family. He said nothing. His presence was his only weapon. Garrison laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Look at this," he sneered. "The town stray thinks he's a guard dog." Before Silas could react, the 2 men seized him. He fought with a desperate, silent fury, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. They beat him to the ground in the middle of the dusty street, the town watching, helpless and ashamed. The last thing he saw before his vision blurred was Myion screaming his name, her face a mask of anguish as her father held her back. He was dragged out of town and left in the dirt, bruised and broken, with a final warning from Garrison: "If you ever show your face here again, they will pay the price for it." The pain in his body was nothing compared to the agony in his soul. He had failed. He had broken his promise. That was the day the boy died and the silent, haunted man was born. He turned his back on the town and walked west, towards the empty lands, carrying the memory of her scream and the weight of his own powerlessness. And now, after a lifetime of silence and solitude, she stood before him, a ghost made flesh, asking a question whose answer had been the only truth in his empty world. The silence in his small, sparse cabin was absolute, a thick blanket he had wrapped himself in for 15 years. Her presence tore it to shreds. He watched her as she slept, a fragile form lost in the folds of the coarse wool blanket he'd laid over her. He had cleaned the dirt from her face with a damp cloth, his movements uncharacteristically gentle, his touch a ghost of a sensation he had long since denied himself. He saw the lines of hardship around her eyes that had not been there in his memory, the faint scar that traced her jawline. This was not the girl from the spring, but the woman she had been forced to become. And yet, the essence of her, the quiet strength that had always drawn him, remained. He sat in his simple wooden chair across the room, the fire in the hearth casting dancing shadows that made the cabin feel both smaller and more intimate. The questions burned in him, a wildfire of confusion and a deep, resonant anger. What had happened to her? To the life she was forced into? Where was Garrison? He pushed the thoughts away. She needed rest, not interrogation. He tended the fire, his actions methodical, a familiar routine that failed to soothe the storm inside him. He had built this life on the foundation of her loss. Every fence post he'd driven into the unyielding earth, every long ride under the empty sky, had been an act of forgetting, a futile attempt to bury the boy who had made a promise he couldn't keep. Now, the past was not just a memory, it was asleep in his bed. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked the land until exhaustion silenced his thoughts. They looked alien, suddenly, as he remembered them touching her face. He felt a profound sense of unworthiness, of being a creature of dust and shadow unfit to be near her light. But beneath the guilt, something else stirred, a fierce, elemental protectiveness that had lain dormant for years. It was the one part of the boy he had never managed to kill. He had failed her once. He would die before he failed her again. The world outside the cabin was vast and dangerous, but in this small, firelit space, he could, for a time, hold it at bay. He watched the steady rise and fall of her breathing, a rhythm that slowly, imperceptibly, began to sync with the beating of his own haunted heart. She awoke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, aromas of a life she had forgotten existed. For a moment, she was disoriented, the hard-packed earth and constant fear of her journey replaced by the warmth of a fire and the solid walls of the cabin. She saw Silas by the hearth, his back to her, his broad shoulders outlined by the morning light filtering through the single window. He moved with a quiet economy, a man perfectly attuned to his environment. He was no longer the lanky, intense boy of her memories, but a man forged into something harder, quieter. The silence that had been his nature as a boy had become his armor as a man. He turned as if sensing her gaze, his expression unreadable. He brought her a plate of food and a tin cup of steaming coffee, setting them on the small crate beside the bed. His actions were practical, devoid of fuss, yet she saw the care in them. It was in the way he had folded her tattered cheongsam and laid it to dry near the fire, leaving one of his own clean, roughly spun shirts for her to wear. It was in the way his eyes met hers for only a second, a flicker of the profound connection that had once defined their world. "You must eat," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. She did, the simple food tasting like a miracle. After, as the sun climbed higher, she told him everything. She spoke of the wedding, a cold, public ceremony where she felt like a decoration. She spoke of the house Garrison built, a mansion that was a beautiful prison, its windows looking out on a town he owned body and soul. She described his private cruelty, the way his charming smile would vanish the moment a door was closed, replaced by a possessive rage that saw any opinion of her own as a personal betrayal. Her father had died 2 years prior, a man broken by a bargain he had made to protect his daughter, only to watch her suffer. Her spirit, however, had not broken. She had planned her escape for months, saving scraps of food, studying the routines of Garrison's men, fueled by a single, desperate hope. She had heard a rumor, a whisper from a traveling merchant, of a silent rancher who lived alone in the Western Territories, a man who answered to no one. The description was vague, a needle in a continent of hay, but her heart had seized on it. It was a fool's hope, but it was all she had. When she finished, a profound silence filled the cabin. Silas had not moved, had not made a sound, but she saw the change in him. The stillness in his body had become a terrifying tension, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He looked at her, and the distance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a fire that was equal parts pain and fury. He rose and walked to a small, dusty chest in the corner. From it, he pulled a worn leather journal. He didn't speak, but opened it to a page and showed it to her. In his father's faded script, it read, "Some things are not for sale, the sky, the wind, and a man's word." He had kept his promise. He had remembered. The fragile peace of their reunion lasted 2 days. It was a borrowed time, a brief, dreamlike interlude where the ghosts of the past seemed to recede. They spoke little, but a new language formed between them, one of gestures and shared glances. He would mend a harness, his powerful hands moving with practiced skill, and she would watch him, the simple act a balm to her frayed soul. She, in turn, brought a subtle order to his stark cabin, her touch softening the hard edges of his solitude. She found wild herbs growing near the creek and brewed a tea that tasted of the earth, its warmth spreading through him in a way the harsh whiskey he sometimes drank never could. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer a void but a space filled with unspoken understanding. He was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to not be alone, and her presence was a slow, painful, beautiful awakening. He felt the ice that had encased his heart for 15 years begin to crack. One afternoon, she walked with him to check the fences along the northern edge of his property. The land rolled out before them, a vast tapestry of sage and rock under the immense sky. It was a hard, unforgiving place, but she saw the beauty in it, the same fierce resilience she saw in him. She reached into a small pocket sewn into the lining of her tattered dress and pulled out a smooth, grey river stone. She held it out to him on her palm. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the small, simple object. It was the stone from their spring, the one he had given her all those years ago. That she had kept it, that she had carried it through her gilded hell and across the brutal plains, was a testament more powerful than any words. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against hers as he took the stone, its familiar weight a shock in his hand. "I never forgot," she whispered. Not for a moment he couldn't speak. He simply closed his hand around the stone, the cool, smooth surface, a connection to the boy he had been, to the promise he had made. In that instant, the 15 years of loneliness, of penance, of silent grieving, collapsed into a single point of searing emotion. He looked at her, at the woman who had crossed a wasteland chasing the ghost of a memory, and he knew his life of solitude was over. He had not built a fortress, he had built a refuge, and its queen had finally come home. But as he looked out at the horizon, a flicker of movement, a distant dust cloud where none should be, caught his eye. The world was coming for them. The borrowed time was over. The dust cloud resolved into a single rider, who approached not with the haste of an enemy, but the weary pace of a messenger. Silas met him in the open, positioning himself between the stranger and the cabin where Myion now stood, her hand on the door frame. The rider was a man Silas recognized vaguely from town, one of the many whose spirit had been ground down under Garrison's heel. His name was Peters. "He knows," Peters said, not dismounting, his voice low and hurried. "Garrison. He knows she's gone. He's tearing the town apart looking for her. He's offering a reward that would make a king blush." Silas remained silent, his hand resting near the cold peacemaker at his hip. His stillness was more intimidating than any threat. "He sent trackers out in every direction," Peters continued, his eyes darting nervously towards the cabin. "One of them cut your trail. He'll be back in town by tomorrow. Garrison and a dozen men will be here by the day after." He paused, then looked directly at Silas, a flicker of something, desperation, or perhaps courage, in his eyes. "He's not just a man anymore, Silas. He's a sickness. He's strangling us all. Don't let him have her." With that, the man turned his horse and rode away, melting back into the landscape, his duty done. The air grew heavy, charged with the coming violence. Silas turned and walked back to the cabin. Myion's face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. "You cannot fight them alone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is my burden. Let me go. I will lead them away from here." He stepped inside, the small space suddenly feeling like the epicenter of the world. He took the rifle from the rack above the fireplace, its wooden stock smooth and cool in his hands. He checked the action, his movements fluid and certain. "I ran once," he said, his voice a low gravelly sound, the words tasting of rust and regret. "When I was a boy. I am not a boy anymore." He looked at her, his gaze holding hers, and in that look was the entirety of his unspoken love, his regret, and his unbreakable resolve. "This is my land," he stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "He is not welcome here." It was a declaration of war. That night, he prepared. He was no longer just a rancher, he was a hunter, and his land was his weapon. He knew every ravine, every rock formation, every dip and rise of the earth. He gathered ammunition, filled canteens with water, and laid out his strategy not on a map, but in the landscape of his mind. Myion did not try to stop him. She recognized the same unbending will in him that had driven her across the plains. Instead, she helped, her fear sublimated into action. She prepared food, sharpened his spare knife, her quiet, steady presence a silent partnership. They were two solitary souls, forged in loss and silence, now united against a common storm. The land would test their hearts, and the test was now upon them. The dawn broke red and violent, spilling across the horizon like a fresh wound. They came as Peters had warned, a dark line of riders against the rising sun. At their head was Garrison, dressed not in his fine suits but in expensive leather, a parody of the men he sought to dominate. He rode with the unearned confidence of a man for whom victory had always been a commodity to be purchased. He reined in his horse 100 yards from the cabin, his dozen men fanning out behind him, their faces hard and mercenary. The air was unnervingly still, the world holding its breath. "Silas!" Garrison's voice boomed, slick with false bonhomie. "It has been a long time. I see you found something of mine. I've come to collect it." The cabin door opened. Silas stepped out, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was followed by Myion, who stood beside him, her head held high, her presence an act of defiance that enraged Garrison more than any weapon could. Her standing with Silas was not the act of a captive, but of an ally. "She is not a thing to be owned, Garrison," Silas said, his voice calm and carrying in the morning air. Garrison's charming facade cracked. "She is my wife. Bound by law and God. And you are a thief and a squatter on land that will be mine by week's end." He turned his venomous gaze on Myion. "Did you really think this hovel was better than the life I gave you? That this silent brute was a better man? He is more of a man in his silence than you will ever be with all your words." Myon's voice rang out, clear and sharp. The insult struck home. With a snarl, Garrison drew his pistol. "Enough of this." The shot was not his. It came from the rocks to the east, a sharp crack that sent Garrison's hat flying from his head. One of his men cried out and clutched a wounded arm. Chaos erupted. This was not the simple confrontation they expected. Silas had spent the night laying traps, using the terrain as his accomplice. He had anticipated their approach, their arrogance. As Garrison's men scrambled for cover, firing blindly at the rocks and the cabin, Silas raised his rifle. His movements were not rushed, they were deliberate, each shot finding a purpose. He was not aiming to kill, but to disable, to dismantle the machine of violence Garrison had brought. Myion, acting on instructions he'd given her, slipped back into the cabin and fired a second rifle from a rear window, creating the illusion of more defenders. Panic began to set in among the hired guns. They were fighting ghosts, a landscape that had turned against them. Garrison, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, saw his authority disintegrating. He spurred his horse directly toward the cabin, his rage overriding all sense. It was the mistake Silas had been waiting for. He stepped into the open, not with his rifle, but with the smooth grey river stone in his hand. As Garrison bore down on him, Silas threw the stone with a powerful, accurate motion. It struck Garrison's horse in the head, a shocking impact that caused the animal to rear violently, throwing its rider to the ground. Garrison landed hard, his pistol flying from his grasp. Silas was on him in an instant, the barrel of his Colt pressed against the man's temple. The fight was over. The hired men, seeing their leader defeated and their numbers dwindling, surrendered. Garrison lay in the dust, his power, built on fear and money, utterly broken by a man with nothing but a piece of land and a promise he'd refused to forget. In the silence that followed, there was only the sound of the wind, whispering that the heart of the land had been tested and found true. The story doesn't end here, not really. It begins. But our time in this world for today is over. If this tale of a love that endured and a promise that was kept resonated with you, help us share it with others. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey. Every story needs a voice, and with your help, ours can echo far and wide. Thank you for listening.